She slammed the door on my daughter's face. The sound echoed through the storm like a final verdict. It was past 7 p.m., and the sky over our quiet suburban street had turned an angry shade of gray. Heavy rain pounded the porch roof like 1,000 small hammers, and cold wind cut through my coat as I stepped out of the car. I wasn't supposed to be there yet. I'd left work early after my daughter's trembling voice broke through the phone. She'd gone ahead to Grandma's as she often did after school. Except this time something was wrong. This is not just another story. It's a betrayal that changed everything. Stay with me till the end. You don't want to miss the moment the door finally opens again. I spotted her immediately. She was standing in front of the door, soaked through, her little backpack hanging off one shoulder, her hair plastered to her forehead. She kept turning the key in the lock over and over, her hands shaking. Her pink sneakers left puddles on the welcome mat. The porch light flickered weakly above her, casting long, strange shadows on the wet wood. "Mama," she cried when she saw me. Her voice cracked. It won't open." I hurried up the steps, taking the key gently from her small hand. It was the same gold key I had given her myself. My father's house key, cut for her when she turned 10. It always worked. Always. I wiped the rain off it and slid it into the lock. It didn't budge. It felt jammed. As if something inside had changed. I tried again, slower. This time, I heard the faint metallic scrape of a newly changed mechanism. Not broken. Replaced. My chest tightened. I glanced at the window to the right of the door, the living room window. Behind the thin curtain, a familiar silhouette stood perfectly still. My mother. Watching. She didn't open the door. She didn't wave. She didn't move. Just watched. I steadied my voice. "It's okay, sweetheart. Let's just knock." She knocked first, soft, hesitant. No response. I knocked harder. The rain kept falling, wind blowing water against my legs, soaking the bottom of my jeans. Still nothing. "Grandma's right there," my daughter whispered, pointing toward the curtain. Her voice was small, like she was trying not to believe what she saw. I nodded slowly. "I see her." For a moment I almost reached for my phone to call. But then, something stopped me. She wanted me to react. She wanted me to knock louder, to shout, to plead, like a trespasser outside her own family's home. But not tonight. I stepped back and looked at the house, really looked. The porch railings, the sagging hanging plant near the door, the faded welcome sign nailed crookedly on the wall. Every corner of this house held a memory. My father's laughter during summer barbecues, my daughter's chalk drawings on the driveway, the nights I stayed awake here after my divorce, rebuilding my life piece by piece. And half of this house was mine, whether my mother wanted to admit it or not. I didn't say it out loud. But I thought it, clear as lightning splitting the sky. Behind the curtain my mother finally moved. The front door opened just 2 inches, just enough for the yellow light to spill out onto the porch. My daughter's face brightened. She took a step forward, expecting warmth. Instead, my mother's voice came through, cold and sharp. "You and your mother don't live here anymore." Then she shut the door. The sound was heavier than the wind. My daughter's shoulders slumped as if the rain itself pushed her down. She started crying quietly, pressing her forehead against the wood. Her tiny hands left wet prints on the door. I knelt beside her, gathering her into my arms. She was cold, shivering, confused. "Why won't Grandma let us in?" she whispered, as if she was the one who'd done something wrong. I stroked her damp hair and looked at the door again. My heartbeat slowed. My breathing steadied. I felt anger, yes, but beneath it was something sharper. Clarity. I whispered in her ear, "We're going to remember this night." Lightning flashed across the sky, briefly illuminating the whole porch. And in that split second, through the small gap between the curtains, I saw my mother's face clearly. She wasn't sad. She wasn't conflicted. She was satisfied. That's when I knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was planned. A car passed slowly on the wet road behind us. Its headlights swept across the house, and I noticed something new. The mailbox by the steps had been freshly painted. My mother never painted anything. She'd hired someone. If she was changing the locks and repainting, this wasn't temporary. She was erasing us. I stood, holding my daughter's hand firmly. "Come on," I said gently. "We're leaving." "But..." No, my tone was soft but final. "We're not begging to be let in. Not here. Not tonight." She looked up at me with wide, tearful eyes. I gave her a small, steady smile. I wanted her to feel safe even though inside me something cold was settling. Not despair. Determination. As we walked back down the steps, I turned to look at the house one last time that night. Rainwater ran down the steps in little rivers, pooling on the sidewalk. The porch light flickered again as if struggling to stay alive. I tilted my head slightly, noticing another detail: the brass number plate near the doorframe. My father had bolted it in decades ago. It had loosened over the years, but I remembered every mark, every screw. I could remove it with 2 turns of a screwdriver. She didn't realize how much of this house I understood. I opened the car door for my daughter and tucked her inside, drying her with an old blanket from the back seat. Her sobs softened into sniffles. I turned on the heater. She fell asleep halfway home, exhausted. But I didn't drive straight to our small rental. Halfway there, I turned onto an old side street, parking under a flickering streetlight. The rain drummed on the roof of the car like restless fingers. I leaned back in the seat and stared out the windshield. This wasn't just about a key, or a door, or even my mother's cruelty. It was about claiming power over something she believed I'd forgotten. I replayed the scene in my head: the jammed lock, the curtain, the freshly painted mailbox, her satisfied expression. Piece by piece, it formed a clear picture, a plan she must have been building quietly. But she had made one mistake. She thought locking the door meant cutting me off. She had no idea I had my father's original safe deposit documents stored away. She had no idea how many old papers I'd kept just in case. She had no idea that I had time, patience, and a memory sharper than she realized. When I finally drove home, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. My daughter was asleep in the back seat, clutching her damp backpack. I carried her inside, laid her on the couch, and covered her with a quilt. She didn't stir. I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the wall clock. My hands rested on the edge of the counter, my mind steady. He thought this was over. He was wrong. I walked to the hallway closet, reached behind an old stack of winter coats, and pulled out a weathered brown box. Inside were files, deeds, bank statements, and a folded note with my father's handwriting. I didn't open them yet. Not tonight. I simply placed the box on the table and turned off the kitchen light. The betrayal was complete. But the game had only just begun. The brown box sat in the center of the kitchen table like a quiet witness. The house was still except for the slow tick of the wall clock and my daughter's soft breathing from the couch. I hadn't opened that box in years. It smelled faintly of old paper and cedar, the same way my father's study used to smell. My hands hovered over it for a long moment before I finally lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of folders, some yellowed with age, others tucked into plastic sleeves. Tucked between them were envelopes, photographs, and slips of paper that looked ordinary to anyone else. But to me, they were fragments of a past I'd almost buried. I pulled the first folder toward me. The edges crumbled slightly under my fingers. Property, Birkwood Lane, the tab read in my father's careful handwriting. Birkwood Lane, that was the house. My house. His house. The one where he'd planted apple trees, fixed leaky pipes himself, and once told me, "As long as this house stands, you'll never be without a home." My throat tightened as I ran my fingers over the ink. He'd written that decades ago. He couldn't have imagined a night like this. I spent the next hour slowly going through each document. Deeds, tax records, mortgage statements. My father had kept everything neatly organized, his signature appearing again and again like a steady heartbeat through time. But something struck me. There were several documents signed jointly, my father and me, dating back to the period right after my divorce. He had quietly added my name to certain property records when I moved back temporarily all those years ago. I'd forgotten the details. Life had been too chaotic then. But he hadn't. A quiet sense of purpose began to replace the sting of humiliation. She thought changing the locks would erase me. But she'd forgotten who filed the paperwork back then. Not her. Him. And me. The kitchen light above flickered slightly, making the room feel older, almost like I'd stepped into the past. The rain outside had stopped, leaving behind the faint drip of water from the eaves. I didn't notice how late it had gotten until the clock struck midnight. I heard soft footsteps. My daughter shuffled into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Mom," she murmured. "Hey, sweetheart." I smiled softly, closing a folder. You okay? She nodded sleepily and glanced at the table. Why are you looking at papers? I hesitated for a moment. She was only a child, but she was old enough to understand some things. Because, sweetheart, I said gently, sometimes when people think they can lock us out, they forget the history we carry with us. She didn't fully understand, but she leaned against me, warm and trusting. I kissed the top of her damp hair. Go back to sleep, baby. Mommy's just remembering a few things. When she returned to the couch, I turned back to the papers. Beneath a stack of tax records, I found a sealed envelope, yellowing at the edges. My name was written on it in my father's hand. My heart skipped. I carefully tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a notarized note, dated 15 years ago. If anything happens to me, my daughter is to retain joint ownership of this house. No one, not even family, can remove her without legal consent. I exhaled slowly, almost in disbelief. He'd seen ahead. He'd planned for this. I traced his signature with my thumb. She had no idea this letter existed. And the thought filled me not with relief, but with a steady, simmering resolve. The next morning, I brewed a pot of coffee and stared out the kitchen window as the sun rose pale and cold over the neighborhood. The storm had left the streets glistening and everything smelled of wet earth and asphalt. My daughter was still asleep. The quiet gave me room to think. I needed more than memories. I needed proof. Official, recorded proof. So, after dropping her at school, I drove downtown to the county records office. It was a squat beige building I hadn't set foot in for years. The floors smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. The reception desk was lined with potted plants that hadn't been watered properly. The clerk behind the counter looked bored until I slid the property address across the desk. I'd like to see all historical title and deed records, I said. She blinked at me. All of them? Yes, I replied calmly. I have time. She raised an eyebrow. Maybe she thought I was another confused older woman trying to sort out her late husband's estate. I let her think that. Underestimation was my favorite disguise. I spent hours in that dusty archive room. Thick binders, microfilm machines, scanning tables. It felt like stepping into another world. One by one, I traced the ownership trail of the house. My mother's name appeared only after my father's death. Before that, mine was right beside his, listed as co-owner on several filings she probably never bothered to read. Then something else caught my eye. A recorded clause from the year I moved out temporarily, stating that the property could not be transferred or sold without dual signatures. My stomach tightened. She must have assumed no one remembered that clause. She never expected me to dig this far. As I copied documents and slipped them into a neat folder, a woman at the next table leaned over and whispered, "Big family mess?" I gave a polite smile. "You could say that." She chuckled knowingly. "Honey, nothing brings out claws like old houses." I laughed lightly, but inside I was thinking, not claws. Strategy. Back home, I cleared the dining table and began laying everything out in order. Old deeds, my father's letter, legal clauses, property tax receipts, county records, all aligned neatly like pieces of a puzzle. The box that had once been dusty now held a clear story. But I wasn't just uncovering papers. I was uncovering timelines, motives, and leverage. Every document told me something about when she had started tightening her grip. It was shortly after my father passed. She had waited, patiently, slowly shifting things until one day she felt bold enough to lock us out entirely. I didn't cry this time. I didn't shake. My emotions were there, but they were sharp, focused. My daughter wandered in after school and watched me for a moment. "Mom," she said curiously, "why are all these papers here?" I gave her a calm smile. "Because, sweetheart, sometimes the past holds answers the present tries to hide." She nodded like she understood more than she let on. She always had my father's quiet way of observing. That evening my phone rang. I let it ring twice before picking up. "I heard you've been snooping around," she said. No greeting, no warmth. "I wouldn't call it snooping," I replied evenly. "Just remembering." A short silence. I could almost hear her calculating. "The house is mine now. You left years ago. Don't stir up trouble." My fingers tightened around the phone, but my voice stayed calm. "Funny. Dad didn't seem to think so." Her voice sharpened. "Don't bring him into this." But I already had. I ended the call before she could regain control of the conversation. As I set the phone down, my heartbeat slowed. She was nervous. And nervous people make mistakes. Over the next few days I made quiet trips. To the bank, to the courthouse, to the lawyer's office my father once trusted. Each visit added another layer to the plan forming in my mind. I wasn't confronting her yet. I was collecting power. On the third afternoon, as I sorted through an envelope of photocopies, my daughter sat across from me coloring. She looked up suddenly and asked, "Are we going back there?" Her question caught me off guard. "Back where, sweetheart?" "The house," she said simply. "Grandpa's house." I met her eyes. They were steady, curious, not fearful like that night on the porch. I smiled softly. "One day," I said. "And when we do, we'll walk through that door like we belong there. Because we do." He went back to coloring. I went back to sorting. But inside something had shifted. It wasn't about if anymore. It was about when. As the week ended, the table was cleared except for a single organized folder, labeled neatly in black ink. Inside were the documents she didn't know I had. Every page was a small, silent promise. When I turned off the kitchen light that night, the folder remained on the table, illuminated faintly by the glow from the hallway. It looked ordinary to anyone else, but to me, it was the beginning of something she'd never see coming. The betrayal at the door had stung. But this digging through dust and memories had reminded me who I was. My father's daughter. Patient. Thorough. Not easily erased. And soon she'd realize it too. The folder sat on the table like a quiet promise, and I stared at it for a long moment before slipping it into my old leather handbag. The hallway light cast a soft glow over the kitchen, and for the first time in weeks, my hands didn't shake when I turned it off. Something inside me had shifted. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was planning. The next morning I woke before dawn. The house was still, my daughter curled under her quilt, the heater humming softly. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the faint light spread across the street. It was the kind of stillness my father used to love. "Mornings are when strategies are born," he'd say. I used to roll my eyes. Now I understood. I spent the morning making phone calls, quiet ones. First to the lawyer my father had trusted years ago, Mr. Grant. His voice hadn't changed. Calm, deliberate, with that dry edge that made you feel both safe and slightly intimidated. "It's been a long time," he said after I explained why I was calling. "It has," I replied. "But I need help. And discretion." He chuckled softly. "You sound just like your father. Come in tomorrow morning. Bring everything." I agreed. No hesitation. After hanging up, I looked around the small living room we were renting. It wasn't bad, clean, modest, but nothing about it felt like home. Not like Birkwood Lane. And I wasn't going to let my mother rewrite history without resistance. Later that afternoon, as I picked up my daughter from school, I saw my mother's car parked across the street. Sleek, familiar, positioned like she was just passing by. But she wasn't. He was watching. I caught her eyes through the windshield for a brief moment. She lifted her chin slightly, not a greeting, more like a reminder of who she thought held control. I didn't react. I buckled my daughter in, smiled, and drove off without a glance back. But inside I noted the move. He was checking. She suspected something was brewing. And she was right. The next day at Mr. Grant's office, I laid out the folder on his polished wooden desk. He took his time flipping through each document, humming occasionally, eyebrows lifting here and there. He didn't interrupt. When he finally leaned back, he let out a low whistle. "Well," he said, tapping a page with his pen. "She's either very confident, or very careless." "Both," I said evenly. He nodded. "You have a strong foundation here. Joint ownership, legal clauses, notarized letters. If she changed the locks and denied access, she's already overstepped." A pulse of relief moved through me, but I kept my voice calm. "I don't want to storm in. I want to do this right." He gave me a knowing smile. "Quiet moves can be the loudest. I'll file preliminary motions to freeze property actions. She won't even see it coming until it's done." As I signed the paperwork, my hands didn't tremble. There was a steady rhythm in my chest. Not excitement, but resolve. Before I left, he said, "She'll try to push back. People like her always do. Stay calm. Let the papers do the talking." I left his office with a stack of stamped forms tucked neatly in my bag. It felt heavier than before, but in the best way. This wasn't just paper anymore. This was a weapon she didn't expect me to use. Over the next several weeks, I played the part of the dutiful daughter perfectly. I attended Sunday dinners at my cousin's house, where she held court like nothing had happened. She smiled at relatives, spread her carefully crafted stories. She moved out ages ago. She doesn't want to be involved. I've been managing everything alone. I smiled back. I didn't argue. I didn't correct. I let her words hang in the air like fragile glass ornaments, waiting for the day they'd shatter on their own. One afternoon, my Aunt Linda leaned toward me at the dining table and whispered, "She says you're thinking of selling your share. Is that true?" I sipped my tea slowly. "I haven't decided anything yet," I said, deliberately vague. My mother's eyes flicked toward us across the table. She was listening. Good. Back home, envelopes started arriving, thick ones from the courthouse, thinner ones from the county office. Each one represented another silent step forward. One evening, as my daughter colored at the table, I carefully filed each notice in chronological order. She looked up and asked, "Why are you smiling like that?" I hadn't realized I was. I laughed softly. "Because sometimes, sweetheart, the best answers don't come from shouting. They come from patience." She nodded solemnly, like she was storing that away for later. Then one chilly Thursday morning, the first sign that the setup was working arrived. My mother called, furious. "What have you done?" she demanded before I could even say hello. "Good morning to you too," I replied lightly. "My bank called. They said the property title has a temporary freeze on it." "What game are you playing?" Kept my tone measured. "No game. Just remembering a few things you might have overlooked." Her silence was sharp. I imagined her pacing the kitchen, her neat little world starting to wobble. "You can't do this," she hissed. "I already have," I said quietly and hung up. My hands were steady as I set the phone down. She was beginning to feel the ground shift, and she didn't even know how deep the roots went. Meanwhile, life with my daughter went on. She had school projects, piano recitals, little triumphs and worries. I kept her world steady, warm, untouched by the storm quietly gathering behind the scenes. One evening after her recital, we stood outside the small community hall as families chatted and hugged. My mother approached us unexpectedly, a pleasant smile plastered on her face. "Well done, sweetheart," she said to my daughter, bending down to hug her. My daughter accepted it politely but glanced at me, uncertain. I put a hand on her shoulder and smiled, playing along. Then my mother straightened, turned to me and dropped her voice. "This little act of yours will backfire. You think you can outmaneuver me? You never could." I tilted my head slightly, like I used to as a child when she underestimated me. "You're right," I said softly. "Back then I couldn't." Then I smiled and walked away, my daughter's hand in mine. I didn't need to raise my voice. My silence unnerved her more than any argument ever could. Weeks later, as winter crept in, my lawyer called. "The court accepted the filing," he said. "All financial activity on the property is frozen. She can't rent, sell, or refinance without your consent." I closed my eyes briefly, letting the weight of that sink in. "Thank you," I said simply. "She'll receive the formal notice in a few days," he added. "Be prepared. It'll rattle her." "I'm counting on it," I replied. Sure enough, the following week she appeared at my door for the first time in months. Her coat was immaculate, her lipstick sharp, but there was a tightness around her eyes. She stepped into my living room as if she still held authority, glancing around like she was inspecting. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she asked, voice controlled but trembling underneath. "Protecting what's mine," I replied evenly. "You're being petty," she snapped. "I've cared for that house for years. You abandoned it. You abandoned me." Her words were rehearsed, polished for sympathy. I let her finish. Then I said quietly, "I didn't abandon anything. I just stopped letting you rewrite the story." She glared at me for a long moment, then grabbed her purse and stormed out. But as the door closed behind her, I noticed something different. A flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't in control anymore. That night, I sat by the window again, watching the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. The wind rattled the branches of the bare trees. My daughter slept peacefully in the next room. And in that stillness I realized something. I didn't need grand gestures. I didn't need to storm the house with fury. All I needed was to keep moving silently, step by step, until the walls she'd built around her false authority crumbled on their own. The silent setup was in motion, and she had no idea how close the ground beneath her feet was to breaking. That night, as the house settled into quiet, I found myself staring at the folder on the coffee table again. The lamp cast a warm pool of light across the documents. I traced the edge of the folder with my finger, steady, deliberate. Everything was ready. The pieces were set. All that remained was to watch them fall. 3 weeks later, on a cold Tuesday morning, the official notice from the court arrived. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, stamped in blue ink. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee as I slid it open. The language was precise and formal, but the meaning was simple. The house was being legally transferred under the joint ownership clause and inheritance protection my father had secured. My mother's exclusive control had ended the moment she changed those locks. A small part of me expected to feel triumphant, but what I actually felt was something quieter. Final. Like the moment just before a door swings open after years of being jammed. The morning of the enforcement, the air felt sharp and cold. I woke before dawn again, the way I had during those early planning days. My daughter's backpack was by the door, her piano books stacked neatly beside it. She was humming softly to herself in the kitchen, spreading jam on toast, unaware of the full weight of what was about to unfold. I tied my scarf around my neck, hands calm. "Grandpa would be proud of you," I told her quietly as I helped zip her jacket. She smiled, not fully understanding but sensing my steadiness. After dropping her off at school, I drove to Birkwood Lane. It was the first time I had pulled into that driveway since the night of the storm. The apple trees in the yard were bare, their branches like thin fingers scratching at the pale winter sky. The porch still had the same flickering light, though it looked dimmer now, almost tired. 2 cars were parked along the curb. One belonged to the sheriff's office, the other to the court enforcement officer. They were standing by the walkway when I stepped out of the car, both dressed in dark jackets, breath misting in the cold. "Mrs. Thompson?" the officer asked. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. He nodded toward the house. "We'll handle the formalities. Once she's served, she'll have to vacate within the hour." I didn't move closer yet. I wanted to see it happen from the sidewalk first, the house in full view. The door that had once slammed in my daughter's face stood just a few yards away. Inside, through the front window, I saw the curtain twitch. A moment later, the door opened, just a crack, the way she had done that night. My mother's face appeared, confused for a split second, then tight with forced composure. "What's going on?" she asked, stepping onto the porch in her robe as if the officers were unexpected guests. "Court order," the sheriff said simply, handing her the documents. She unfolded the papers with shaking hands. Her lips moved as she read, and slowly her posture changed. The confident lift of her chin faltered. Her shoulders stiffened. She looked up at me across the yard. Her expression was a mix of disbelief and fury. "You did this," she hissed. I met her eyes without flinching. "I remembered what you forgot." The officers entered the house to begin their inspection. I stood near the porch steps, breathing in the cold air, each breath sharp against my lungs. My fingers brushed against the brass number plate near the door, the one I'd noticed that rainy night. Loosened but still there. My father had put it up himself. I remembered standing on this very porch as a girl, holding a flashlight for him while he drilled the final screw in. Inside, drawers opened and shut. The officer's voice was calm, procedural. My mother's was rising, brittle with panic. She followed them from room to room, protesting, insisting it was a mistake. "This is my home," she snapped. One of the officers responded evenly, "It's a shared property. And the court has issued legal transfer. You were notified." Notified. The word hung in the air like a quiet bell. She had received the paperwork weeks ago but dismissed it, probably assuming I wouldn't follow through. That was always her mistake, assuming I wouldn't. Neighbors began to appear at their windows, curtains shifting, faces curious. It was the kind of street where everyone noticed everything. Mrs. Patterson from across the road came out onto her porch, clutching her shawl. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind people give when they've been silently watching everything unfold and finally see the scales balance. A memory flashed. My daughter standing right here, soaked in the rain, knocking on this very door. Her small voice calling out, unanswered. That image anchored me as I climbed the porch steps slowly. The wood creaked under my boots. Inside, the living room looked exactly as I remembered, except colder. The furniture was neatly arranged, the walls spotless, but it felt empty in a way it hadn't before. My mother stood in the center, clutching the documents like a lifeline. "This is cruel," she said, her voice cracking, not from sorrow but from the shock of losing control. "No," I replied softly. "Locking a child out in the rain was cruel. This is justice." The officer approached me. "You can walk through the house now. Official transfer is in effect." I nodded. My steps were slow but sure as I moved through each room. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, just as it had when my father was alive. The clock above the sink ticked steadily. I paused at the hallway where family photos once hung. Most of them were gone now, replaced with her curated displays. But on the far end, one photo remained. My father and me standing in front of the apple trees years ago. She hadn't taken it down. Maybe she'd forgotten. I reached out and ran my fingers lightly over the frame. In the master bedroom, the officer pointed out where she would need to remove personal belongings within the hour. Her dresser drawers were neatly packed, as if she'd been ready to defend her space at a moment's notice. She wasn't expecting to lose. People like her rarely do. She followed me down the hallway like a storm cloud. "You think this makes you strong?" she spat. "Taking the house like this? You're just proving you're as cold as I am." I turned to her calmly. "No. I'm proving I learned how to survive because of you." For a second, something flickered in her eyes. Not regret, but recognition. She saw me differently then. Not as the obedient daughter, not as the woman she could shut out, but as someone she couldn't control anymore. Outside, the officer informed her of the final terms. She had 1 hour to leave voluntarily before movers would be called to remove any remaining items. She looked at me one last time, searching for some crack in my expression. There wasn't one. Slowly, she walked up the steps, entered the house, and began gathering her things. No yelling now. No performative gestures. Just the sound of drawers opening and closing, footsteps moving down the hall. I stepped onto the porch again and leaned against the railing, watching the neighborhood return to its usual rhythm. A car passed slowly, a dog barked in the distance. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of damp wood and cold air. This was the same porch where she once stood with triumph, declaring that my daughter and I didn't belong. Now I stood here while she packed to leave. Life has a way of circling back to the very door where it began. When she emerged with the last box, she paused at the top of the steps. Her face was pale but composed, like someone trying to keep the last pieces of pride from crumbling. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. I met her gaze. "No. I'll remember this." She held my eyes for a long second, then turned and walked to her car. The trunk slammed shut, echoing down the street. She drove away without looking back. As the officers left, I stood alone on the porch. The wind was softer now. I turned the key, the same key that had failed that stormy night, in the lock. It slid in perfectly this time. The door opened with a familiar creak, the sound of home returning. I stepped inside, closing it gently behind me. For a moment, I simply stood in the entryway, listening. The house felt different, not empty but waiting. My father's presence lingered in small details. The worn patch on the wooden floor, the faint ticking of the hallway clock, the way light filtered through the kitchen curtains. I didn't cry. I didn't cheer. I breathed. Fully. The door had reopened. But this time it wasn't for her. I stood in the entryway, the door gently closed behind me, my hand still resting on the cool brass handle. The house was quiet, not empty, not hostile, just waiting. For years, it had stood as both refuge and battlefield. Tonight, it felt like it exhaled with me, as though we had both survived something long and bitter. The faint ticking of the hallway clock guided me forward. My boots echoed softly against the wooden floor as I walked deeper inside, taking in every detail. The kitchen curtains swayed slightly in the draft, and a strip of pale winter sunlight reached across the floor like a hesitant hand. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and dust, familiar and distant at the same time. I ran my fingers along the hallway wall, where the paint had chipped near the baseboards. My father had painted this hall himself one summer. I could almost hear his voice, steady and calm, saying, "Take care of what lasts." He had meant the house, but he'd also meant me. I made my way into the living room. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes and listened. No shouting. No footsteps pacing with authority. No voice telling us we didn't belong. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing outside. Peace had a sound, and this was it. I started with the curtains. She had replaced my father's heavy drapes with sterile beige ones years ago. I pulled them down in one smooth motion. Dust scattered into the sunlight, swirling like tiny memories set free. Behind them, the original curtain rods my father had installed were still intact. That small detail made me smile. She'd changed the surface, not the structure. I opened the windows wide. Cold air rushed in, sharp and clean. For the first time in years, the house smelled like outside air, not her carefully controlled stillness. Next, I moved to the bookshelves. She had rearranged everything, replacing my father's books with decorative ornaments and polished picture frames of her carefully curated legacy. I started removing them one by one, stacking them gently on the floor. Behind one row of porcelain figurines, I found something that made me freeze. A small leather-bound notebook, dusty and untouched. It was my father's handwriting on the cover. My breath caught as I opened it. Inside were notes, dates, quotes he loved, and, on the last page, a list written in his neat script. What I want for this house. A place for her to rebuild. A place where my granddaughter will laugh. A place that remembers us. I sat down right there on the floor, the sunlight spilling across my lap, and let a few tears slip silently. Not the bitter kind. The kind that felt like closing a door gently instead of slamming it. Later that afternoon, I picked my daughter up from school. She climbed into the car, tossing her backpack into the back seat. "Where are we going?" she asked, noticing my quiet smile. "Home," I said simply. When we pulled into the driveway, her eyes widened. She pressed her face to the window. "Are we really?" I nodded. "We're home, sweetheart." She jumped out of the car and ran up the steps, her hair bouncing, her boots leaving little wet prints on the porch. I handed her the same gold key that had once failed us on that stormy night. She slid it into the lock with both hands, turned it, and the door opened with a soft creak. Her laugh rang out down the hallway. It was bright, clear, and warm, bouncing off the walls like a bell. She kicked off her boots and ran from room to room, calling out, "This is ours now." I followed slowly, watching her touch the walls, peer into corners, fling open doors. Her joy filled every empty space. She stopped by the window in the living room, where sunlight now poured in through the bare windows, and turned to me. "Grandpa's house remembered us," she said softly. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. It did. Over the next few weeks, the house began to transform back into something familiar. Not through renovations but through care. My daughter helped me scrub the baseboards and repaint the chipped hallway. We found old curtains tucked away in a cedar chest upstairs, the deep blue ones my father had loved, and hung them back up. I repaired a loose cabinet door, she wiped down the dusty shelves. Piece by piece, the house seemed to respond to our touch, shedding the cold layer she'd wrapped around it. I decided to frame my father's letter, the notarized document that had protected us when everything else was taken. I hung it right above the front door, centered where anyone entering would see it. Beneath it, on a small wooden shelf, I placed his photograph. Him standing under the apple trees, hands in his pockets, that slight grin he always had when he thought no one was looking. Every time I passed the door, I felt grounded. The very place where betrayal had happened now stood as a monument to justice. About a month later, I received a letter in the mail from my mother's lawyer. It was formal but thin, no real power behind the words. She had withdrawn her opposition, surrendering her claims without contest. Whether it was exhaustion, humiliation, or the realization that the law was no longer on her side, I didn't know. And honestly, I didn't care anymore. She moved into a small apartment across town. I heard through Aunt Linda that she didn't host family dinners anymore. The cousins visited less. Whispers followed her like a shadow at church. People remembered that stormy night. They remembered the door. I didn't gloat. I didn't visit. I didn't call. My revenge wasn't about watching her crumble publicly. It was about reclaiming what she tried to erase. And I'd done that. Spring came early that year. One morning, as I sat on the porch drinking coffee, I watched my daughter climb one of the old apple trees in the yard. Her boots slipped against the bark, but she laughed, waving at me from a low branch. The breeze carried the faint scent of blossoms. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that smell. She jumped down and ran over to me. "Can we have people over? Like a big picnic? Like Grandpa used to do?" I smiled. "Yes." I think it's time. We invited family, neighbors, and a few close friends. On the day of the picnic, the yard was filled with folding chairs, homemade dishes, children chasing each other across the grass. Laughter echoed through the open windows. For the first time in years, the house felt alive. Not because it was perfect, but because it was ours. Late that afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the guests began to leave, I found myself standing alone by the porch steps, looking at the house. The front door gleamed in the orange light, the brass handle polished, the framed letter above it glowing softly from inside. I thought about everything that had led here. The storm, the slammed door, the silent legal battle, the walk through the house with officers by my side. Every piece of it had brought me back to this moment. I whispered softly, "Thank you, Dad." A gust of wind stirred the branches of the apple trees, scattering petals across the porch like a quiet reply. That evening, after my daughter went to bed, I walked through the house alone. I paused in each room, not as a visitor or intruder but as someone finally home. In the living room, I opened the window and let the night air drift in. In the kitchen, I placed fresh flowers on the counter. In the hallway, I stopped beneath my father's framed letter. I ran my fingertips over the edge of the frame, steady and grateful. This house had remembered everything. Every fight, every laugh, every betrayal, every act of quiet resistance. And in the end, it had sided with the truth. With me. I turned off the lights one by one until only the porch light remained. The house settled into silence, warm and alive. Standing at the doorway, I glanced back one last time before heading upstairs. My father's photograph caught the faint light, his grin still the same. I smiled back. The door had once been slammed against us. Now it stood wide open, not just for me but for the future we'd built inside. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away. Subscribe for more powerful revenge stories like this one. Emotional, dark, and unforgettable. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive.